It began one morning when she noticed something impossibly wrong. As she walked through the village square, sunlight spilling across the cobblestones, she glanced down, and her shadow was gone. The familiar black shape that had always mirrored her movements was nowhere to be seen. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, a fleeting illusion caused by the angle of the sun. But as she moved, the absence persisted. Her heart tightened with unease, a strange, cold sensation creeping along her spine. She looked around, hoping to see another villager who might notice it too, someone to reassure her that it was nothing, just a passing shadow play. But the villagers were all busy with their routines, and when they glanced at her, their expressions flickered with something else: uncertainty, discomfort, perhaps even fear. Whispers began to travel like wind through the crowd. "Did you see her shadow? It's gone," some said, barely louder than the rustling leaves. Others shook their heads, dismissing it, but the unease had already begun to take root. She tried to walk casually, pretending she had not noticed, but the sensation of her missing shadow was impossible to ignore. It was as if a part of herself had been erased, leaving an empty, hollow space at her feet. With each step, she felt a strange weightlessness, a lightness that should have been freeing, yet only deepened her fear. Every movement she made felt unnatural, incomplete, as though the ground itself had lost its familiarity, and the world was subtly out of place. By midday, rumors had begun to spread through the village. Mothers clutched their children closer, men stopped in their tracks mid-task, and even the animals seemed to sense the change, their ears twitching and bodies tensing as she passed. "It's a curse," an elder whispered to another. "Her shadow is the mark of spirits," a mother murmured to her son. The words did not reach her directly, but the vibrations of fear around her were unmistakable. She could feel it, like static in the air, the villagers' unease almost tangible. Despite the growing whispers, no one came to speak to her directly. Some glanced, their eyes wide with suspicion or terror, but quickly looked away, as if acknowledging her absence of shadow might invite it into themselves. She began to notice other subtle things. Objects in her path seemed to darken unnaturally, trees cast shadows that shifted oddly, and at times, the air itself seemed to carry a faint echo, a memory of what should have been. It was as though the world recognized that a part of her essence was missing, leaving behind a gap that trembled in the quiet corners. By evening, the fear in the village had escalated. Groups gathered in hushed clusters, debating the cause, offering guesses that ranged from the mundane to the mystical. "Spirits are testing her," someone said. "She is marked by something," another whispered. She could hear the words, feel their vibrations, and though none were addressed to her directly, the implications settled on her like a cloak of invisible iron. Something had shifted, and the village, whether they understood it or not, sensed it too. Alone in the fading light, she stood still and looked down at her feet. The ground beneath her remained unbroken, sun-drenched, ordinary, yet her shadow was not there. Her pulse quickened. Questions without answers crowded her mind. Why had it vanished? Was it a warning? Or was it a prelude to something far more powerful, far more dangerous than she could yet imagine? She knew one thing with absolute certainty: life would never be the same again, and neither would the villagers. That night, as the moon rose and the village settled into uneasy sleep, she lay awake, pondering the absence beneath her. Somewhere, in the spaces between light and dark, her shadow existed. Or perhaps it had become something else entirely. And whatever it was, she had no choice but to face it, for the balance of power had already begun to shift, and her life, her very essence, had entered a realm where nothing would remain ordinary again. The morning after she noticed her shadow had vanished, a tense silence hung over the village. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing, and the wind whispered softly through the streets, carrying a subtle chill that made the villagers pull their cloaks tighter. She walked cautiously toward the outskirts, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. Her footsteps were careful, deliberate, but even so, she could feel eyes following her from behind doors, windows, and fences, measuring, judging, waiting. It was then that the old seer appeared, as if drawn by the disturbance in the air. No one remembered seeing her arrive, yet she stood at the edge of the clearing where sunlight barely reached the ground. Her robes were worn and layered, smelling faintly of herbs and smoke, and her eyes, deep and knowing, seemed to see beyond the ordinary world. The villagers instinctively gave her space, parting silently, as though they feared being too close to someone who understood what they could not. The seer's gaze fell on her, unflinching, sharp as a blade, yet strangely comforting. "You have lost what no one can take from you," the seer said softly, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Yet what is gone is not gone forever. It has been called, drawn, awakened." The words were cryptic, but her tone carried authority, leaving no room for doubt. The girl felt her pulse quicken. The seer's knowledge, far older than the village itself, seemed to pierce through the uncertainty that had begun to settle like fog in her mind. "Why is it gone?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why is my shadow missing? Is it a curse?" The seer shook her head slowly, her hands clasped over a wooden staff carved with intricate symbols. "Not a curse," she replied. "A warning. Shadows do not vanish without reason. They leave only when something stirs deep within the soul, something that others may fear, something that awakens the unseen. You are marked, child. Marked not by malice but by power. And those who cannot comprehend it will tremble in its presence." The girl shivered, unsure whether to feel fear or awe. Her shadow had always been a silent companion, following every step, echoing every movement. To lose it was to feel a strange emptiness beneath her, like the ground itself had shifted, leaving her unbalanced. And now, to hear that its absence was a sign of awakening, of hidden power, made her chest tighten with anticipation and dread. The seer moved closer, her voice lowering to a whisper that seemed to resonate with the very air around them. "There are forces in this world that you cannot see, yet they see you. The ones who seek to harm, to control, to deny what is yours, they will be drawn to the shift in your essence. Your shadow has left to grow, to prepare, to guide you. It is no longer just a reflection. It is a witness, a guardian, a force that will return to you when the time is right." Her words were heavy, each syllable leaving a mark on the girl's mind. The villagers peered from behind doors, sensing the tension but unwilling to approach. The air was thick with something unspoken, a feeling that the ordinary rules no longer applied. Even the sun seemed hesitant to shine fully, as though aware of the unseen currents gathering in the clearing. "Listen carefully," the seer continued. "Do not attempt to force it back. Do not fear its absence. Learn to observe, to sense, to listen to the whispers it leaves behind. Shadows are patient, and so must you be. The moment will come when it returns not as it was but transformed. And when it does, those who underestimated you will understand the cost of their doubt." The girl nodded, trying to absorb the weight of the warning. Her shadow was gone, yet the seer's words ignited a flicker of understanding deep within her. The power that had been dormant was stirring. She could feel it in the quiet of the trees, in the trembling of the leaves, in the strange silence that followed her through the village streets. Something had changed, not just in her but in the world around her. As the seer turned and disappeared into the misty edges of the village, the girl stood alone, the first hints of resolve forming in her chest. The warning had been given. The unseen was awakening. And when her shadow returned, it would bring with it a force that no one, not even the villagers who had watched her with suspicion, could stop. Night fell over the village like a velvet shroud, thick and quiet, and with it came a sense of unease that she could not shake. The sun had disappeared hours ago, leaving behind only the pale glow of the moon, but the familiar comfort of her shadow had not returned. Its absence left her feeling unbalanced, as if some vital part of herself had been ripped away, and she could feel the world around her responding in kind. The trees whispered secrets, the wind shifted unpredictably, and the earth seemed to hum faintly beneath her feet. She stepped out of her small home, her bare feet touching the cool stones of the village path. Normally, she would have hurried indoors before darkness claimed the streets, but tonight something compelled her to move slowly, deliberately, listening to the sounds around her. Each footstep felt heavier, echoing unnaturally, and she could sense a presence following her, though when she turned, there was nothing but empty air and dancing shadows. The villagers had long avoided her, casting suspicious glances from their windows and doorways, whispering among themselves. Tonight, however, there was nobody in sight. It was as though the world had contracted around her, focusing all attention on the space she occupied. And yet she did not feel alone. There was something in the darkness, just beyond perception, that seemed to guide her, to whisper encouragement, to awaken awareness she had never known she possessed. She reached the edge of the forest, where moonlight barely pierced the thick canopy. The air here felt different, charged, almost alive. A faint rustle among the branches made her pause, and she realized that the shadows themselves were moving unnaturally, stretching and bending, as if acknowledging her presence. Every instinct screamed caution, but another part of her, deeper and stronger, urged her forward. She had to understand what was happening even if it frightened her. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it whispers she could not fully decipher. At first they were faint, like the brush of fingers against her ear, but they grew steadily louder, though still indistinct. "Follow, listen, awaken." they seemed to say, though she could not be certain if it was the wind, her imagination, or something more. She swallowed hard and took another step, feeling the vibrations of something unseen beneath her feet. The path seemed to guide her, and for the first time in weeks she felt a strange sense of purpose amid the fear. As she moved deeper into the darkness, the world around her grew stranger. Shadows twisted independently of objects, leaves swirled in eddies of air that had no apparent source, and the faint glow of the moon seemed to bend, highlighting shapes that should not exist. It was as if the night itself had become alive, responding to her presence, alert to her every movement. She felt the faintest brush of her shadow at her feet, a hint, almost imperceptible, that it was still there, observing, waiting, learning. Her breath came in slow, careful rhythms as she tried to steady her racing heart. The fear she had felt earlier, the panic of losing something so familiar, was still present, but it was joined now by curiosity and determination. Something in the night was awakening alongside her, something older and wiser than the village could understand. She could sense it, a pulse, a rhythm, a consciousness that responded to her emotions and intentions. Hours passed, though time seemed meaningless in the stillness of the forest. She stopped to rest, sitting on a moss-covered stone, and allowed herself to listen. The whispers continued, and for the first time they made sense. Patterns of sound, shifts in the air, subtle movements in the shadows. Each hint was a lesson, a clue, a small piece of knowledge that her shadow, though missing, was trying to communicate. By the time the first faint glow of dawn touched the treetops, she had learned much. She could sense the boundaries of the unseen, the limits of the shadows, and the faint stirrings of power that had lain dormant within her. Her shadow may have vanished from the light of the village, but it was far from gone. It had retreated into the night, gathering strength, growing awareness, and preparing for the moment it would return. She walked home with cautious optimism, the first rays of sunlight catching the dew on the grass. Her absence of shadow no longer filled her with panic, but with anticipation. The night had spoken, had guided, and had awakened something deep inside her. And when the shadow returned, it would bring with it a power the village could not ignore, a force that no ordinary fear could contain. The night arrived quietly, almost as if it had been waiting, patient and unyielding. The village was asleep, shuttered windows blocking the moonlight, yet she could feel the air trembling with anticipation. The streets were empty, shadows pooling in corners, stretching longer than they should, and a soft breeze whispered along the rooftops. She had waited for this moment all day, feeling the weight of absence beneath her, knowing instinctively that what had left her would return. And then it happened. At first it was subtle, a dark ripple along the cobblestones, a shift in the shadows that made the hair on her arms stand on end. She stopped walking, heart hammering, eyes scanning the darkness. Something moved independently, a presence that was not quite her own, yet intimately familiar. Her shadow, once absent, now crept ahead of her, larger, darker, and pulsing with an energy that was almost alive. It moved with intention, not merely following her but observing, learning, and waiting for her to acknowledge it. She knelt to touch the ground where it seemed closest, and the air hummed with power. The village was oblivious, unaware that the familiar part of her had returned, transformed. It was no longer a mere reflection but a force of its own, something that carried weight, consciousness, and a presence that demanded attention. Every nerve in her body tingled as she realized that her shadow was not simply back, it had changed. It had grown, absorbed the night, and now carried a strength that the villagers could not comprehend. From her window, a lone villager stirred, drawn by the faint vibration of the returning darkness. Their eyes widened in disbelief as they glimpsed the shadow stretching unnaturally, its form thick and solid in the dim moonlight. It was no longer a passive echo of her movements, it had intent. Even from a distance, its energy radiated, reaching out to the edges of the village, pressing on the hearts of those who had once mocked, ignored, or doubted her. Fear flickered in their eyes, though they could not understand the reason. The girl stepped cautiously forward, feeling a strange sense of reverence mixed with power. She could hear a low, almost inaudible hum emanating from the shadow, like a heartbeat, or perhaps a whispered chant in a language older than the village itself. The wind stirred, leaves danced in spirals, and the night seemed to bend around her. She raised her hand tentatively, and the shadow responded, curling upward like smoke, forming shapes that flickered and vanished, leaving a trail of faint light in the air. It was communicating, testing, guiding, an ally she had never known she needed. She took a deep breath and spoke softly, uncertain if her words would carry. "You have returned." The shadow shifted instantly as if acknowledging her voice, drawing closer, yet maintaining an aura of independence. It was powerful, intelligent, and strangely protective. She understood then that this was no mere reflection. It had absorbed the night itself, feeding on the absence it endured, and now it had become something beyond her initial understanding. Across the village, whispers began, even from those who dared not step outside. "Did you see it?" someone murmured. "Her shadow, it has grown, it is alive." The words were hushed but carried through the still air, traveling from home to home, stirring unease in every heart. The girl felt the tension, the collective uncertainty, yet it did not frighten her. Instead, it strengthened her. Her shadow's return was a signal, a shift in the balance. What had been missing was now empowered, and she alone could command its growing strength. For hours she remained in the quiet square, testing the limits of the returned shadow. It moved around her, mimicking her movements at first, then acting with subtle independence, its form dark and fluid, capable of bending, twisting, and stretching beyond the natural laws she had known. The night itself seemed to obey, responding to the shadow's presence, and with each passing moment she felt a connection deepen, an understanding that this part of her was no longer just a shadow, but a companion, guide, and protector. By dawn, the villagers had begun to notice subtle changes. The air felt heavier, the morning sun struggled to break through clouds that were thicker than usual, and an inexplicable fear lingered at the edges of the streets. Her shadow had returned, yes, but it carried with it a power they could not stop, a force that belonged not to the village but to her. And as she walked home, her heart steady and her mind alert, she knew that life had shifted irreversibly. The night had returned her shadow, but it had done so transformed, and the village would never see her the same way again. The moment her shadow returned, she felt a strange, almost imperceptible shift. At first, it was subtle, a flicker at the edge of her vision, a gentle tug at the corners of her mind, like a whisper carried on the wind. But as the night deepened, she realized it was more than a reflection. It was alive, aware, and capable of communication in ways she had never imagined. She had always thought of shadows as silent companions, following her passively, reacting only when she moved. But now this one pulsed with intent. When she took a step, it hesitated, almost as if testing her will. When she paused, it lingered, hovering slightly apart from her, as though observing and evaluating her thoughts. The sensation was disorienting yet exhilarating. Her pulse quickened, and a shiver ran down her spine as she whispered, almost involuntarily, "Can you hear me?" To her astonishment, the shadow responded, not with words, but with a subtle movement that conveyed meaning. It stretched, curled, and formed shapes in the dim moonlight, conveying emotions: curiosity, patience, guidance, even warning. She realized she could sense its intentions, feel its presence not just physically but mentally. The bond was strange, intimate, and undeniable. It was as though the shadow carried a fragment of her own consciousness, yet also something older, wiser, and independent. Over the next hours she experimented cautiously, speaking to it in whispers, asking questions she had never dared to voice aloud. "Why did you leave?" she murmured. The shadow twisted into an undulating ribbon of darkness, pulsating with a rhythm she could almost understand. Then it shifted closer, brushing against her legs as if reassuring her. Its response was not in language, yet she knew, with a clarity that surprised her, that it had left to gather strength, to learn, to prepare. And now it had returned, ready to guide her in ways she had not yet imagined. As the night deepened, she discovered another remarkable truth. The shadow could show her glimpses of things she could not see. When she focused, images would flicker across the space around her, events that had happened, paths she could take, dangers she had not yet perceived. It was a teacher, revealing lessons hidden in darkness, giving her knowledge that no ordinary human could grasp. The power it carried was immense, yet it demanded patience, awareness, and respect. Missteps could be dangerous, for the shadow was not merely a servant, it was a force of nature with its own instincts. She realized that communication with it required concentration and calm. When fear or anger overtook her, the shadows around her would writhe uncontrollably, reacting unpredictably. But when she centered herself, the shadow became harmonious, mirroring her intentions, guiding her, even protecting her. It was a living mirror of her inner strength and potential, a reflection of abilities she had not yet dared to explore. By midnight, she began to understand the depth of the connection. The shadow could anticipate danger, sensing intruders in the village, subtle shifts in the wind, the approach of enemies or threats unseen by ordinary eyes. It moved before she did, warning her with tremors along her skin, nudges of air, flickers of darkness. It was no longer merely a companion, It was a guardian, and she, in turn, had to learn to trust it fully. For the first time she felt a profound respect for what had seemed like an absence. Its leaving had not been a loss, but a preparation. And now, in its return, it offered guidance, protection, and insight. She began to understand the whispers she had heard in the forest and the subtle movements in the night. They were her shadow's voice, speaking in gestures, shapes, and vibrations that required focus to interpret. By the pre-dawn hours she could sense a rhythm in the night, her breath, her heartbeat, the pulse of the shadow. She moved slowly through the village, feeling it stretch, curl, and flow around her, always just beyond sight, yet impossible to ignore. She knew that when the villagers awoke, they would sense something different about her, even if they could not see it. Something had changed. The girl and her shadow were no longer separate, and their bond carried a power that demanded attention, respect, and caution. As the first light of dawn touched the rooftops, she paused at the edge of the square, feeling her shadow pulse with awareness beside her. It was no longer a passive reflection. It was a voice, a teacher, a sentinel. And she knew with absolute certainty that its guidance would shape everything to come. The world had shifted, and with her shadow speaking beside her, she could face whatever awaited in the night, armed with a power that was both terrifying and magnificent. The village slept uneasily under the faint glow of the moon, but she could feel it stirring, like a living thing bracing for an unseen danger. The streets, silent to the untrained eye, hummed with subtle tension. Doors creaked, shadows stretched unnaturally, and even the wind seemed hesitant as it wove through the alleys. Her shadow moved alongside her, a coiled, attentive presence, guiding her awareness toward disturbances she could not have perceived on her own. She sensed it before she saw it. A subtle shift in the energy of the village, a barely audible scrape of movement that did not belong to the night's natural rhythm. Her pulse quickened, but her steps remained deliberate, careful. Her shadow, now more than a passive reflection, twisted and flickered, sending warnings through the air like tiny tremors she could feel in her chest. Something had entered the village, something intent on mischief, harm, or worse. The threat revealed itself in fragments at first. A door swung open where no one lived, a flicker of movement across a darkened courtyard, a low, almost inaudible growl that rumbled through the still night air. Her shadow pulsed in response, curling outward, elongating toward the danger. She instinctively followed its guidance, weaving through the village's narrow streets, keeping to the edges of alleyways and avoiding any direct line of sight. Every step was calculated, every breath careful, as though even the smallest misstep could awaken the malevolence that now crept through the home she had walked for years. As she rounded a corner, the intruder became clearer, a figure cloaked in darkness, not entirely human, moving with fluid precision. Its presence carried a weight, a sense of malice sharpened by intent, and she could feel the tension in her shadow spike like electricity racing along a wire. The being's movements were deliberate, stalking, seeking something, or someone. Her heart pounded, yet she did not retreat. The shadow beside her whispered in its own language, urging caution, guiding her along paths that allowed her to remain unseen while tracking the figure. The village itself seemed to respond to the intrusion. Animals scuttled from doorways, chickens hurried into coops, and even the wind seemed to bite colder, carrying faint whispers of alarm. No ordinary fear had summoned this. This was something older, more intelligent, more dangerous. Her shadow's pulse intensified, wrapping around her feet like a living cloak, offering protection, sending signals of the threat's proximity. She realized then that the being was drawn not just to her, but to the power her shadow now carried. It was aware of her connection, sensing the force she had not yet fully mastered. She kept to the shadows, moving silently across the village square, observing the figure from a safe distance. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet she held her ground. Her shadow, extending beyond her reach, seemed to communicate a strategy, patience, observation, and a careful assessment of the danger. The night had taught her to listen, to sense, and to trust the guidance of the unseen. The threat may have been powerful, but it had not yet realized it faced more than a girl. It faced a bond between girl and shadow, one that could anticipate, protect, and strike when necessary. Time stretched as the figure prowled, unaware that it was being observed with extraordinary vigilance. She noted the way it moved, its pauses, the slight tremor in its steps when her shadow brushed near, unseen yet potent. Her understanding deepened. The being was intelligent, cunning, and aware, but it underestimated the power now aligned with her. And as dawn approached, she sensed a shift. The creature hesitated, confused by the unnatural presence surrounding her, its dark form recoiling slightly from the concentrated awareness of the shadow's guidance. By the first light, the intruder had vanished, slipping into the edge of the forest with its intentions unfulfilled. Her shadow settled once more around her feet, calm but alert, a reminder that the village was not yet safe. The night had shown her the vulnerability of her home, the cunning of unseen enemies, and the importance of her growing power. The threat remained lurking in the darkness, but she now understood that she was no longer merely a target. She was a force to be reckoned with, and her shadow was her sentinel. The morning sunlight filtered through the village, but it did nothing to warm her mind. Instead, her thoughts remained tethered to the night, to the shadows, and to the mysterious intruder she had faced. The bond she shared with her shadow had grown, but questions pressed relentlessly at the edges of her consciousness. Where had this power come from? Why had it awakened only now? And what, exactly, was its true nature? She returned to the edge of the forest, the place where the night had first revealed the shadow's strength. The trees seemed to welcome her, branches stretching like ancient hands toward the sky. She knelt, tracing her fingers across the roots and moss-covered stones, trying to feel the pulse of something that had always been there, waiting for her. And then she felt it, a faint vibration, subtle yet undeniable, moving through the earth and into her veins. Her shadow shifted slightly, sensing her awareness, as though confirming the presence of knowledge long hidden. It began slowly, images and sensations that were not her own, yet deeply familiar. She saw a woman long ago standing in the same forest, her eyes closed, her hands raised to the sky. Dark shapes moved around her, coiling and twisting, yet she stood unafraid, commanding without words. She felt the woman's heartbeat, her determination, her connection to the forces beyond ordinary sight. And then suddenly the images shifted. The woman's form dissolved into shadows, curling into a shape that moved independently, a consciousness capable of choosing, protecting, and guiding. This was the origin of her own shadow, the ancestral force that had been dormant until the night it returned. A low whisper carried through the trees, not audible in ordinary terms, but felt deep in her chest. It spoke of lineage, of women in her bloodline who had been linked to the unseen, who had carried shadows like guardians, spirits that lived in the edges of light and darkness. Some had been revered, some feared, and some had been silenced, their gifts hidden to protect the living or to prevent misuse. She realized with a sharp pang of understanding that the shadow was not a mere reflection. It was a legacy, an inheritance older than the village itself, passed silently through generations, waiting for a soul capable of awakening it fully. The forest seemed to breathe around her, leaves trembling, air rippling with unseen currents. Her shadow flickered in response, expanding slightly, almost as if it recognized the truth she had just uncovered. It was alive, yes, but also ancient, carrying memory, purpose, and wisdom far beyond what she had imagined. Each movement it made, each subtle pulse she felt, was a reminder that it had existed long before her, and it would continue long after, guiding, protecting, and judging when necessary. Questions that had tormented her suddenly seemed to align with this revelation. The intruder that had stalked the village, the power that had awakened during the night, the feeling of absence followed by return, all of it was tied to the shadow's origin. It was a force that responded to threats, a sentinel of her lineage, and a teacher for the one capable of wielding it. She understood that the strength she now possessed was inseparable from the shadow itself. To ignore it or misuse it would invite disaster. She rose slowly, feeling the weight of her newfound knowledge settle into her bones. Her shadow stretched beside her, pulsating, coiling, and shifting with a deliberate awareness. It had waited for her to understand, for her to recognize the truth of its origin. And now that understanding had been reached. The village, the threats, and the dangers she faced were all part of a larger tapestry, one she had only just begun to see. The wind picked up, carrying whispers that seemed to echo from the past, voices of ancestors who had wielded shadows before her. They spoke of patience, discipline, and purpose, guiding her steps even without words. The forest, the shadows, and her own heartbeat aligned in a rhythm that resonated deeply within her. She realized that the true challenge was not just survival, it was mastery. Mastery of her bond, mastery of the unseen, and mastery of the responsibilities that came with such power. As she turned back toward the village, the shadows around her moved with a subtle intelligence, flowing like a river of darkness. She felt a profound connection to them, to her ancestors, and to the night itself. The secret of the shadow's origin was no longer a mystery, It was a revelation, a promise, and a responsibility. And with that understanding she walked home, ready to face whatever the world would send her way, knowing she was no longer alone. The village was quiet, almost deceptively so, as if it had been holding its breath in anticipation. She moved cautiously through the empty streets, her shadow stretching ahead like a living entity, coiling and flickering with a purpose she no longer doubted. It was no longer merely her reflection. It was a sentinel, a guide, and a weapon, moving with intent and precision. Every step she took was mirrored by the shadow, yet it acted independently, anticipating dangers and scanning the darkness for threats. She had sensed the intruder again, lurking near the edge of the village. The being was intelligent, patient, and malevolent, preying on fear and ignorance. But her shadow, now awakened and fully aware, pulsed with a strength that made the air hum around her. It had learned, grown, and adapted in ways she could not have foreseen. She understood now that the true confrontation would not be physical alone. It would be a clash of awareness, intent, and the unseen forces that danced at the edges of night. As she approached the square, she could feel the intruder's presence as sharply as if it had been standing right in front of her. The shadow responded instantly, extending and thickening, curling into shapes that twisted the moonlight into unnatural patterns. The figure froze, sensing the shift in energy, the unnatural intelligence now guiding her steps. It was a predator accustomed to fear, but her shadow radiated an authority that was impossible to ignore. "Show yourself," she whispered, voice steady though her pulse raced. The shadow twisted, forming a dark spiral in front of her, a barrier that was alive and aware. The intruder stepped from the edge of the forest, its form flickering between solidity and smoke-like distortion, eyes glowing with malice. It had underestimated her and, more critically, it had underestimated the power of the bond she shared with her shadow. The being advanced, but every move it made was anticipated. The shadow reacted before her thoughts fully formed, twisting around the intruder's path, striking preemptively with tendrils of darkness that were felt as pressure, heat, and warning rather than direct attack. She watched as it recoiled slightly, unprepared for an opponent that seemed to exist in multiple places at once. Her own fear had vanished, replaced by clarity. She and the shadow were united, and that unity made them formidable. The intruder hissed, a sound like metal scraping stone, and lunged. The shadow responded instantly, coiling around it, constraining it, while the air itself seemed to pulse with resistance. Leaves and dust swirled violently, forming a barrier that blurred vision and confused the senses. She realized that her shadow did not just protect. It manipulated the environment, bending perception to its will. Every instinct the intruder relied on now betrayed it, every movement met with counterbalance and restraint. "Yield," she commanded, though the voice felt secondary to the will of the shadow. It pulsed, spiraled, and stretched, speaking a language older than human speech, and the intruder's form shivered as if recognition had dawned too late. The creature faltered, realizing that it faced not a girl but a force beyond ordinary comprehension. Its confidence, built on years of hunting and deception, faltered in the face of a bond that had learned, adapted, and now commanded the very night. With a final surge, the shadow wrapped around the intruder, pressing, folding, and immobilizing without harming. The being struggled, but the darkness had become a cage, a mirror of its own intent now turned against it. She could feel its fear, its realization that it had been outmatched not by strength alone, but by awareness, unity, and the intelligence of something that had lived before her birth. The intruder froze, and for a moment the village held its breath. Then, slowly, it dissipated, retreating into the forest, leaving behind only the echo of its presence. Her shadow retracted, coiling gently around her legs, calm but alert, a sentinel still watching. She exhaled, feeling the tension leave her muscles, though a part of her knew this victory was only temporary. The night had tested her, the shadow had guided her, and together they had prevailed. By dawn the village would sense a shift. The girl who had once been overlooked now commanded power that could not be ignored, and the intruder had learned that neither fear nor malice could match the unity of a girl and her shadow. She had faced the threat, survived, and the night itself seemed to acknowledge her triumph. The shadow pulsed gently beside her, and she knew with certainty that they were ready for whatever came next. The night was thick and heavy, the kind of darkness that seemed almost liquid, pressing against the edges of perception. She stood at the edge of the village, feeling the familiar pulse of her shadow at her feet, stretching outward like living ink across the ground. It had grown since its return, no longer a timid reflection but a sentient force with purpose, awareness, and the capability to act independently. Tonight she would learn the full extent of its power. She focused, closing her eyes and listening. The shadow pulsed with her heartbeat, vibrating in rhythm with the night itself. It had been guiding her, teaching her patience, awareness and restraint, but now it called for more. She could feel the latent strength that had always been there, a reservoir of ancient knowledge and ancestral will. Each exhalation drew it closer, and each heartbeat seemed to synchronize with the shadow's undulating movements. She sensed its readiness, an intelligence that had been waiting for the moment it could act in full. Around her, the village slumbered, oblivious to the awakening storm of power that surrounded it. The intruder, or any who sought to challenge her, would find no ordinary opponent here. Her shadow stretched into the darkness, branching, thickening and pulsing with awareness. It was no longer tethered solely to her body, it moved ahead, scanning, sensing, adapting. Every corner of the village, every hidden alley, every gap in the fence was now under its watchful eye. She opened her eyes and extended her hand. The shadow responded instantly, rising and twisting into shapes that mirrored her intent. She thought of the intruder who had stalked the village, and the darkness bent, curling into a protective barrier that pulsed like a heartbeat. She felt the air thicken, charged with a tension that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The shadow now acted with deliberate force, capable of influencing the unseen currents of night, bending perception, and creating an aura of dread for any who dared approach. A faint rustle from the forest made her pulse quicken. The shadow stretched toward it, coiling and spiraling as if to envelop whatever dared cross its path. She felt a surge of exhilaration. The connection between her and the shadow was complete. It did not merely obey her will, it amplified it, transformed it, made it greater than the sum of its parts. A step, a breath, a thought, all rippled outward, shaping the darkness itself. The intruder emerged, hesitating as the shadow expanded before them like a living wall of black flame. Eyes wide, it realized too late that the girl it had underestimated was no longer alone. The shadow flared, pulsating in a pattern that conveyed both warning and judgment. The air seemed to hum, charged with the latent energy of generations past. Every instinct the intruder had honed over years of deceit and stealth now betrayed it. The night itself seemed aligned against it, guided by a force older and wiser than it could comprehend. She concentrated, and the shadow responded, moving as one with her thoughts. It surged forward, enveloping the intruder in coils of living darkness that pressed, constricted, and contained. Not to harm but to subdue, to teach respect and caution. The being struggled, but the shadow anticipated each movement, bending its path, neutralizing intent and forcing recognition. With every pulse, the intruder felt the weight of something beyond human comprehension, a force born not of violence alone but of intelligence, unity, and ancestral power. The village around them remained still, yet it felt the change. The wind shifted, the trees shivered, and distant animals reacted to the presence of something extraordinary. She realized that the shadow's power extended beyond her control, touching the environment, influencing perception, and shaping reality in subtle but profound ways. It was a force of judgment, guidance, and protection, a culmination of everything her lineage had carried, waiting for the right moment to act. By dawn, the intruder had retreated, broken in spirit if not in body. The shadow retracted, curling softly around her feet, calm yet alert, a silent sentinel. She felt the depth of the bond fully now. It was not merely her shadow, not merely a companion, but an extension of her essence, capable of defending, guiding, and teaching. She had witnessed its full power and in doing so, had understood the responsibility it carried. As the first light touched the rooftops, she stood in the square, shadow still at her side, feeling the pulse of the night fade into morning. The village would never be the same, for the girl and her shadow had awakened, and their combined strength would shape everything to come. She was no longer a target, a victim, or a passerby in the world's darkness. She was a force, and her shadow was the voice that would ensure the world knew it. The first light of dawn spilled over the village, soft and golden, but it could not diminish the presence that had awakened during the night. She stood in the square, her shadow stretching behind her, coiling and twisting like living smoke, a silent testament to the power that now pulsed through the land. The villagers began to stir, eyes blinking against the brightness, yet they moved with a careful hesitation. Something had changed. The girl they had ignored, mocked, and feared was no longer ordinary. She looked around slowly, noting the faces of those who had once laughed at her weakness, now pale with awe and unease. The intruder had vanished, retreating into the forest, leaving only whispers of its defeat. But the true transformation was not in her enemy's disappearance, it was in the balance of power that now existed. The shadow, fully awakened and aligned with her will, had revealed the strength that lay beneath her quiet exterior, a force that commanded respect without demand and struck fear without cruelty. The villagers whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what they had seen. The shadows of the night, once ordinary companions of darkness, now seemed charged with intent, bending subtly around her as if they too acknowledged her sovereignty. Children clutched their mother's hands, elders paused mid-step, and the strong warriors who had once ignored her looked to the ground, unsure how to measure their place in this new order. For all their physical might, they realized that true power had taken form in ways they had never imagined. Her shadow moved with deliberate elegance, coiling around objects, brushing lightly across the ground, and occasionally flickering in ways that drew gasps from the observant. It had become an extension of her essence, capable of acting independently, anticipating threats, and protecting her without conscious thought. It was a force born of her lineage, awakened through trials, observation, and necessity, and now it moved in perfect harmony with her intentions. She could feel the pulse of its awareness, the memory of ancestors flowing through its undulating forms, and the lessons of generations guiding each flicker, each subtle movement. For a long moment she allowed the villagers to witness the full scope of the shadow's power. It did not strike, it did not harm. Instead, it commanded attention, demanded recognition, and instilled an understanding deeper than words could convey. Fear and respect mingled in the square, a potent reminder that weakness was only what others perceived it to be. Her body remained the same frail form they had mocked, but the bond she shared with the shadow transformed her into something far greater than appearances could suggest. A subtle wind stirred, lifting dust and leaves in gentle spirals that traced the outline of her presence. The villagers felt it on their skin, smelled the charged air, and understood, without explicit explanation, that this girl had passed beyond ordinary human limits. She had become a sentinel, a force that the village could neither challenge nor control, but one they could learn to respect. Her shadow, coiled yet fluid, moved around her as though protecting not only her but the balance of the world she had inherited. She spoke, her voice calm and unwavering, carrying authority that resonated with the subtle intelligence of the shadow. This village has long overlooked what it cannot see. The strength of one is not measured by muscle alone. Power can reside in silence, in patience, and in the bond between what is visible and what lingers unseen. The villagers nodded, some in awe, some in fear, and some in reluctant acceptance. They had witnessed the demonstration. They understood the lesson. From that day forward, the balance shifted. Her shadow remained at her side, a living testament to the inheritance she carried, to the trials she had endured, and to the mastery she had achieved. Villagers began to treat her with respect, seeking her guidance in matters that went beyond simple disputes. The intruder never returned, for the tale of her power had spread beyond the village, carried by whispers and shadows alike. And though the sun rose, casting ordinary light across ordinary streets, the girl and her shadow remained extraordinary. She had transformed from a figure of derision into a figure of authority, a living reminder that true strength often lies in unexpected forms. Her shadow, once a silent companion, now ruled alongside her, guiding, protecting, and teaching. And the village, forever changed, would remember that power does not always roar. It sometimes moves in silence, shaping the world in ways the unobservant cannot perceive until it is too late. The dawn was hers, and with it, the world had learned a simple, enduring truth. Never underestimate the one who moves with the unseen.